Thank you all for coming. My name is Rod Giltaka. I'm the CEO and Executive Director for the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights. I'd like to share with you our organization's position on Bill C-71. But first, I'd like to highlight the composition of what we call a licensed gun owner here in Canada. It is critical that Canadians understand this in order to understand this bill. A licensed gun owner not only has to pass a course, pass an extensive background check, reveal their conjugal partners for the past 2 years, receive written consent from their spouse if they have one, provide 2 personal references, all of whom will be interviewed themselves, wait 3 months, and then be run through CPIC every day for as long as they hold that license. So for clarity, when Canadians are run through the Canadian Police Information Center, they're typically being investigated as if they're having an interaction with law enforcement. It's really important for Canadians to understand the system beneath the system. Overall, we think that even gun owners are going to be disappointed with Bill C-71, primarily because gun owners, like everyone else, want a safer Canada also. This legislation is being proposed to solve 2 problems. The first is something we all agree should be dealt with. We have a growing gang problem in some parts of Canada. Both rural and urban gang activity seems to be increasing, as is the violence that accompanies it. This legislation does nothing to address that problem. In the simplest of terms, by virtue of the people and the activities they're engaged in, we know these are not licensed gun owners. We also know for certain that licensed gun owners do not represent a disproportionate risk to public safety. This is a fact that isn't disputed by any side of this debate. Every single part of this bill further regulates licensed gun owners, and no part of this bill is designed to change the behavior of criminals. As I said, I'm sure this is disappointing to everyone involved in this issue. In the interest of brevity, I'd like to provide a couple of short examples. This bill revokes the long-term authorization to transport, or ATT, needed for a licensed gun owner to take their handgun to a gunsmith to have it serviced, for example. It's not that this activity is no longer acceptable under this bill. It absolutely is. But under this legislation, the owner would need a short-term ATT, which requires a request to the Canadian Firearms Program, approval by the Firearms Center, processing, and mailing a piece of paper which is physically carried by the owner to the gunsmith. And if the short-term ATT is valid long enough, they can use that same piece of paper to go retrieve their firearm once it's done. This needs to be done every single time. The same is true in other common activities that a licensed firearm owner, would be lawfully engaged in. This measure is ridiculously, profoundly wasteful and completely ineffective in changing the behavior of criminals and gang members. And I would also add, you don't have to understand the inner workings of law enforcement to comprehend this. Also under this bill, the Liberals would create 2/3 of a long gun registry. We were told that there would be no new registry, yet the system proposed would add to a database all of the same information except the serial number and description of the firearms being transferred. The infrastructure required to track and store this process would be similar, if not identical, to the previous long gun registry. I'd like to remind Canadians that this was a project that was supposed to cost a nominal amount of taxpayer funds and ended up ballooning to over $2 billion. All in an effort to add yet another layer of policing to licensed gun owners. That's really important to understand, licensed gun owners. Precisely the people who aren't involved in the criminality we're trying to eliminate. Now the Liberals are describing what I just told you as verifying a PAL is valid before a transfer. This certainly sounds reasonable, innocuous, and inexpensive. The same methodology is consistent throughout the entire bill. These are only a few highlights in our review of the bill, and we will be releasing a detailed analysis via nationwide press release in the coming days. I'd like to turn over the floor to my colleague Tracy Wilson to discuss the second problem that this bill attempts to solve.
Thanks, Rod. Thanks, Rod, and thank you all for being here. Good morning. My name is Tracy Wilson, and I am the Vice President of Public Relations for the CCFR. I am also an avid hunter, a sports shooter, a mother, and a grandmother. The second problem that was identified by public safety is domestic violence involving firearms. While some men are victims of this type of abuse, women are drastically overrepresented in this category. To understand the role that this legislation plays in addressing this problem, we need to understand the current system and at some level understand how it works. By way of Mr. Giltaka's statement, we are informed of the requirements to be included in this highly vetted and monitored group we call licensed gun owners. Not only are these safeguards in place for those who can legally own and use firearms, the Canadian Firearms Program operates a 1-800 line dedicated to instantly report a safety concern should one arise. The program has a well-known record for seizing firearms first and asking questions later. In addition, every other service from intervention by law enforcement, counseling, and a variety of community support programs are available to everyday Canadians when needed. At this moment, our current system is doing everything possible to address this issue and adding more layers of bureaucracy to an already over-regulated system will be again wasteful and ineffective. There is nothing in this bill that will improve this situation. Many Canadians may not know that Statistics Canada keep fairly detailed stats on family violence. In fact, they release a report on it every year. In the 2016 report, you can refer to Table 3.4. StatsCan reveals that firearms were present in less than 1% of all calls to police concerning domestic violence. In addition, it's critical to understand how StatsCan defines firearm present. It does not necessarily mean that the firearm was used in any way during the altercation. We don't know what that actual number may be. Now, in no way does this mean that even one genuine occurrence of this type of violence isn't worth preventing. No one on either side of this debate would ever think that. The point is, we need to be responsible in our use of resources, meaning taxpayer money and the time and effort of law enforcement. If we are going to invest in a solution, it needs to work as intended. We honestly don't see anything in this bill that would reasonably benefit women suffering from domestic violence. In summary, the CCFR cannot support this legislation as it has been presented this week. As Mr. Giltaka mentioned, the CCFR will have a full analysis of the bill and our concerns in the coming days, which will be available online. I'd like to turn the floor back over to Rod if you have any questions.
Just so I'm clear. Sorry, I'm Julie Van Dusen, CBC. So you don't see this as a return of a registry, but you see it kind of as a 2/3 registry. Could you just explain it a little bit?
Absolutely. So the idea is that we're going to verify that someone has a valid PAL, a valid firearms license, before a transfer can occur. But what's the devil in the details in this situation is that it's not just a legal obligation to verify that someone has a PAL. There's no infrastructure being created just to check that. What happens is, if there's a non-restricted transfer between private parties, the firearms center has to be notified on both sides of that transaction. Then consent needs to be given by the firearms program, and a reference number is issued and stored. So this is very similar to how restricted firearms are transferred. So the infrastructure to do that for extended period of time requires a database, web portal, people staffing, all that infrastructure, almost identical to the long gun registry.
Okay, so you use an example of you are taking your gun to be cleaned. Right. So can you just walk us through what steps would you have to take if this bill is passed that you don't have to take now, and as simple as possible?
Okay, so right now, if you have a firearms license, you can take your firearm to and from 5 different places. To and from a border crossing to shoot competitively, to and from a gunsmith to have your firearm serviced, to and from an approved shooting range in your region, which is typically your province, to and from a peace officer to have the firearm verified or to turn it in for destruction, or to and from a gun show. So these are typically things that law-abiding, licensed, fully monitored gun owners do. So in Bill C-42, the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act, the government at the time said, you know what, we don't need you to ask permission every single time. We've already established that we trust you to keep restricted firearms and non-restricted firearms without any other oversight, so go ahead and do your normal stuff. The reasons why you would have short-term authorizations to transport before would be things that are odd, like moving. That doesn't happen every day or every month. So this legislation removes everything other than going to the range. And the reason why we reject this is because if I can go to and from the range with my firearm and I'm a licensed gun owner, how is it a risk to public safety for me to go back and forth to the gunsmith or to a peace officer to have the firearm verified or to turn it in for destruction?
So what do you think they think it's a risk?
I don't believe they think it's a risk at all. I believe that they're doing the same thing throughout this entire bill, which is to increase the perceived level of security, the perceived level of safety.
And so you talked about C-42, which doesn't exist now, and that got rid of all that. But can you just mention the extra steps you would have to go through with the new bill?
With the new bill, well,
Like
specifically,
if you're taking it other than anywhere other than the range.
yeah, absolutely. I described that in the statement. Yeah, it's one more time.
Phoning someone, paperwork, dropping something in the
Exactly.
mail.
So I, as a gun owner, would say, okay, well, in 2 weeks, I would have to actually plan that 2 or 3 weeks in advance to have my firearm serviced. I would call the firearm center. I'd say, hey, I want to apply for a short-term ATT. Someone would take that information. They'd want the dates. Then they would decide whether or not they're going to grant me that privilege to drive my gun, whatever, maybe 4 or 5 blocks over to the gunsmith. Then they would approve that. They would process that, record that information, generate paper mail it to me. Then I would take it out of the envelope, put it in my pocket, take my gun, drive it to the gunsmith. If the period of time they're allowing me to drive back and forth to the gunsmith is long enough, maybe they're able to fix that firearm in that time, and I can use the same ATT to return the firearm back. And I would have to do this every time.
If you don't have the piece of paper to go to the gunsmith, he can't clean your gun, or he or she.
If I don't have the piece of paper, I'm committing a criminal offense.
Which would be liable with what?
On a summary conviction, that would be a $5,000 fine and or up to 6 months in, actually $5,000 fine and or 6 months in federal prison, or on an indictable, meaning I knew I was breaking the law and I did it anyway, that rebellious act. It's a 2-year first offense, up to 2 years, 5 years for second or subsequent offense.
So the Conservatives, to my last question, considering the Conservatives got rid of all that with C-42, why do you not think they're screaming blue murder right now?
I think that they're being very careful and they want to understand the bill properly, and this is just my personal opinion. They want to understand the bill before they come out against it.
Well, if you understand it, why don't they understand it?
Well, I'm going to help them as best I can to, I'm sure they have their own plan, I'm not privy to that, right?
So you say this doesn't, and when you answer, if you could just look toward the cameras,
Absolutely.
but you say this doesn't address the issues around gangs and illegal gun violence, and it doesn't address the issue of domestic violence. So what do you think the point of this is? Why do you think the Liberals put this bill forward then?
I think the point specifically is they made some campaign promises. If I want to get a little bit sharper in my comments, I'll do that. They need to do something to fulfill those promises. And the real answer to reducing or eliminating gang violence takes more than 4 years. It takes about 10 years. And what that is persuading people not to take part in gangs. So after school programs, community outreach, giving kids something to do, giving them hope, giving them opportunity. And that's a very long process, and it's a lot harder work than saying, Rod, go ahead, you're going to have to carry an extra piece of paper when you take your firearm to the range or the gunsmith or what have you. And unfortunately, that's just the reality of it. There's no way around that.
Do you think that they're specifically targeting legal gun owners, or that you're just sort of getting caught up in the mix of an election promise and following through with that then?
I don't think that it's a matter of specifically targeting gun owners. It's just a matter of we're the most convenient group to foist this on, because, as I said in the statement, law-abiding gun owners have never represented a disproportionate risk to public safety. We comply with the law 100% every day, all day long, no matter how ridiculous the regulation, and we're just the easiest place to go to create that perception of safety.
And finally, would you be happy with amendments to this bill, or do you think that the bill should be scrapped outright? And what would the electoral, heading into the 2019 vote, do you think the Liberals might face some problems with this, especially in rural communities where hunting and legal gun owners are more prevalent?
I think they're going to face problems with this with anyone that can think critically and understands how our existing system works. I don't think it's a win for no one. And I say that genuinely. I don't think it's a win for increasing, in the idea that we want to increase safety in Canada. There's no win here. So it really is wrapped up in a campaign promise, and as usual, they target everything at the people that are clearly not doing the shooting, people that aren't the problem.
Do you speak any French?
No, I wish I did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Rod, hi. Tim Melnitz.
Nice to meet you, Tim.
Nice to meet you. So, with regard, a couple questions. With regard to the gangs and guns, your association was at that Gangs and Guns Summit. I think, is it not the case that the other contents of the election gun platform are aimed at covering that? The money, the $100 million a year, $80 million over the next 5 years to the CBSA. So have they claimed directly that this bill actually is going to reduce the number of assault rifles and handguns?
So that isn't specifically in the bill, but that is exactly what the answer is. Increased funding, increased resources for community groups and for law enforcement, that tackles gang issues. That's on the street, a real solution. And so we're 100% in favor of that. We all want a safer Canada. There's 2.1 million licensed gun owners, and they're largely all great people. And certainly we're the most monitored and most compliant people in the country because we have to be. So we are 100% behind that. But it's reality. I mean, I don't think anything I've said today is unreasonable or difficult to understand. We need to target the people that are actually doing the shooting.
Okay, now just the top end of yours. So I don't know whether you mentioned the reclassification issue.
So the reclassification issue.
Getting rid of the cabinet power to overrule them.
Right. So that's a bit of a complex issue because there's a lot of background there, and I don't want to drag you guys around too long. The reason why we reject that measure in the bill is right now, and in time immemorial, when in terms of the Firearms Act, the RCMP have been doing this work. Except what the situation is today is they're doing that work under oversight from the government. So should they make a mistake or they do something inappropriate in their methods or what have you, at least there's one last line of defense to say, well, hang on, that's not the right way to do it, and the government can step in. The change in the legislation just says you'll do the same job that you were doing forever, except now there is no oversight. You can do anything you want, and you can't be stopped by anyone. So we think it's antithetical to our system. We don't have police affecting laws that way and enforcing the law.
I just want to ask a question for me anyway.
Sure.
The reference number, how does it actually even be a pseudo registry? Since the information that is, the transfer contacts the registrar to confirm the valid license, registrar checks, and then sends back a reference number. But the transferor is not obligated to send any information about the non-restricted firearm that's being acquired.
Right, and that's the one thing that's missing.
Right. How is it a registry?
So the infrastructure required and the approval process that's required is 2/3 of the way to a registry. But, maybe that's an improper fraction. Maybe it's about 3/4 of the way, because all the infrastructure that the registry that was dismantled because it was found not to have a positive impact on public safety, it was found to be wasteful and ineffective. They're going to rebuild that because, and there's one particular point that makes that necessary. It's the approval of the firearms program and the creation of a reference number. That's the part there. So we're being told, we just want to make sure that the PAL is verified, and that makes all the sense in the world. And most, I'd say 99.9 unqualified percent of gun owners go, I'm not going to sell a firearm to somebody that doesn't have a valid PAL. A lot of people call in and verify that information anyway. I don't know anybody that would not at least want to see the card and make sure that it hasn't expired, because we don't do that. But this new requirement requires that structure to be there, and it's I think the reason why we reject it is because how much bureaucracy do you need to pile on top of each other to get to a point where you're satisfied, right? We know that law-abiding gun owners, licensed gun owners, are not involved in this type of criminal activity. We know that, right? StatsCan keeps numbers on that too. So I'm just not sure what the purpose of the bill is.
Well, as far as I know, the purpose is to just to obligate transferors to validate the license and obligate the transferee to produce the buyer to produce the license, right?
And then we can just put that in the bill then. But the extra infrastructure is unnecessary, and it's the rebuilding of that database to create a long gun registry. Yeah.
Brian Plow with the National Post. It sounds like what you're saying is that they set up all this infrastructure, they go 3/4 of the way, and then it would not be that difficult down the road to just take that final step and add in the guns as being part, like the actual information about the guns as being part of the transfer. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I mean, is there another, like, is there in your mind a better solution for how to do that verification part of verifying licenses during a sale?
I think if we talked about solutions, that would be in committee as this bill makes its way through the legislation. It's they're the government. They're supposed to come up with an appropriate solution, and we're there to help them.
Yesterday, the Liberal Party sent out a fundraising email. Did you hear about that?
No, I've been busy.
Yeah, you were on your way here, or just so. In this fundraising email, which we wrote about yesterday, the Liberal Party accused Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives of. This is a fundraising email that is based on Bill C-71. So then they say later on in the fundraiser that throughout this theme is that the Conservatives are going to fight this and try and get it rolled back again. And they say that they're taking their instructions from the Canadian NRA. So I do know that the advocacy groups from the firearm side participated in the 2011 in the sense of being third parties and taking part in the election campaign 2011 and 2015, and that, like you, several of the groups also sort of took sides in the Conservative leadership race. So what is this? How do you react to that allegation that you need Canada's NRA, all of you?
Collectively, well, we're very separate groups, and we have a very very distinct mandate. You have a couple of other groups that do follow a kind of a lobbying model or what have you, but we specifically, the CCFR, are a public relations organization first, and then we have registered lobbyists after that. So we are nonpartisan. Certainly the appearance of partisanship can start forming because obviously we're talking and supporting people that are going to support licensed gun owners, people that would willingly have their name run through CPIC as if they're being investigated for a criminal offense every day. These are good people, and we know that. It's not controversial. So we're a nonpartisan group. We're just there to help where we can, and we're more than happy to help the Liberal Party should they ask. We've met with some Liberals here. Well, we've been here for a week almost. So yeah,
You met with some Liberals, and
we'll record all that stuff in our lobby log. Yeah.
Liberals who are concerned about the legislation?
I'm sure certainly rural Liberals should be concerned about this legislation. I mean, if you have a memory, you can remember back 2 election cycles ago where the Liberal Party was literally decimated down to 34 seats, the lowest they had ever been in the history of elections in Canada. And a big part of that was their continuing assault on all the people that aren't doing the shooting. And it's logical. I can't say that it would happen the same way in the next election, but it's certainly not beneficial. You know, law-abiding licensed gun owners, they're not shooting anyone. We haven't hurt anyone. We still haven't hurt anyone, and we just really want to be left alone. I don't think that's unreasonable.
Yesterday in question period, the Conservatives didn't focus on this issue at all. You know, they have the power to make this a political issue if they want, as the primary opposition party, and also the party that had passed some of this, you know, some of the laws that are being rolled back in this bill. Do you think you're going to get much political support from them on this?
I'm not sure I can answer for the Conservatives. Again, we're not really a partisan organization. Certainly we want to talk to anybody who wants to talk to us and assist them in fighting this bill. But Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know what their strategy is. Certainly, we're going to make it a political issue because it's just not right.
When the previous gun registry, we had a lot of demonstrations on the Hill from hunters and big demonstrations. Do you think these proposed changes, if they go through, are enough to see that return?
I'd like to think so, because it's just unjust legislation and it doesn't have a purpose for being. It's not going to solve the problem. So we're going to do everything we can to help that process along because we don't want this legislation to go through.
Are you getting the sense out there through social media or otherwise that people are riled up about this the way they were about the gun registry?
We've seen a huge surge in membership and donations, more than we've ever seen. We're probably the youngest of the firearm organizations, but we haven't seen a surge like this before. So,
Define huge.
Huge for us.
Well, like 50 people, 600, like what's huge?
In the thousands.
How much is your membership?
We don't release those numbers for a couple of reasons. Obviously, we don't want gun owners thinking, well, there's enough people helping. We don't have to help, and at the same time, we also don't want people to make a judgment on what our capabilities are based on our membership.
But if I was going to phone you and ask if I could buy a membership, you would have to tell me, right?
No.
How would I pay you then?
Oh, you are more than welcome to join. We can give you a card after as well, in case you're interested. Absolutely, yeah.
You would tell me how much it would cost.
Oh, how much it would cost?
Oh,
how much is it?
$40. How much
Yeah, it's
is-
$40. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought you meant how many members do we have?
Oh, I
Yeah. That would be an interesting business model, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no,
Just give me your credit card number and I'll tell you later. Yeah. I don't know. Do you think we can get away with that? I'd be willing to entertain it.
For a while.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Focus up. All right.
Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
Join the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights by visiting us at www.firearmrights.ca.